Cochise is one of the most recognizable names in the American West. A formidable Apache leader from the 1860s and 1870s, he was instrumental in the history of the American Southwest, and Arizona specifically. He also negotiated a peace treaty with General Oliver Otis Howard with the help of Thomas Jeffords in 1872. This occurred in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains east of Benson and Tucson, Arizona. This is the story of that event, the history and archaeology surrounding it, and the people involved. Cochise rose to prominence by 1858 when he became the principal leader of the Chokonen band of the Chiricahua Apache. This was a group that occupied primarily the Dragoon, Chiricahua, and Peloncillo Mountains of southeastern Arizona. He steadily grew in stature as a courageous warrior and a cunning tactician. His influence became so great that during the height of his leadership, he was able to summon, at will, forces from surrounding bands. Cochise's band was, even at its strongest, limited to about 1,000 people, counting men, women, and children. It was one of the smallest bands, yet one of the most widely respected and feared. Cochise remained one of the best-known Apache leaders because of his prominence and his fierceness as a warrior. Cochise's people were known as the Chokonen band of the Chiricahua Apache. The Chokonen were nomadic by nature. They were more nomadic than many other Apache bands. They ranged from northern Mexico up to present-day Arizona and over into extreme southwestern New Mexico. So they were highly mobile, and this is what distinguished them. They lived in wickiups, not teepees. General Oliver Otis Howard is another character in this story. He's often referred to as the one-armed general. He lost his arm in the Civil War and is considered a Civil War hero. He's also the Christian general. He was known for persistence, integrity, and his religious character. Thomas Jonathan Jeffords was a U.S. Army scout, prospector, Indian agent, a deputy sheriff of Tombstone, a mail contractor, and a stagecoach driver in the Arizona Territory. He got the name captain because he was a small boat captain before he came west. Born in New York, Tom Jeffords came west to Arizona in 1862 as a scout for the U.S. Army. Warfare with Cochise's Chiricahua had begun the year before when Cochise was accused by the Army of kidnapping an 11-year-old white boy from a nearby ranch. Jeffords was the superintendent of a mail line. After some of his mail riders were killed by Apache raiding parties, he rode alone into Cochise's camp to parley. This bravery so impressed the headman that he became a friend to Jeffords, granting his mail riders safe passage. He lived out the last 22 years of his life in the Tortolita Mountains north of Tucson. He found fame as the only white man to win the trust and friendship of Cochise. It was Jeffords' presence that made it possible for General Howard in 1872 to gain an audience with Cochise and eventually forged the historic agreement that put an end to Cochise's war. Another important character, because of the photographs she took and her correspondence, is Alice Rollins Crane, who traveled to Tucson in 1895 in search of material for a book she was planning on writing about Native Americans. But while in Tucson, she met Thomas Jeffords, then in his mid-60s, and immediately became fascinated by the Apache and the 1872 peace expedition that Jeffords had led. Her black and white photos taken while camping in the stronghold with Jeffords made the rediscovery of the actual treaty campsite possible. Joseph Alton Sladen was the aide-de-camp and secretary to General Howard, and importantly, he wrote 2 long accounts of the encounter with Cochise's band. These will be referred to throughout this video. The story of Tom Jeffords, General Howard, Cochise, and the Apache Wars was told in historically based but dramatized form in a novel, Blood Brother, by Elliot Arnold, that was adapted to a 1950 film and a 1956 television show that ran for 72 episodes. Both were titled Broken Arrow. The Cochise War began in 1861 when a brash and inexperienced officer named Lieutenant George Bascom held Cochise and his band responsible for the kidnapping of a local rancher's son. Actually, two Western Apache bands from the White Mountains raided the Johnny Ward Ranch on January 27, 1861. One group took 20 head of cattle, the other took 12-year-old Felix Ward. The pass led to the Chiricahua Mountains, so the inference was made that the Chokonen, or Cochise Apaches, had been responsible since that was their territory. Cochise, his family, and others were taken into a tent and held as prisoners. This is called cut the tent by the Apache because Cochise cut the tent and escaped, but the others were held. 3 of these warriors, and 3 more captured a few days later, were hung by the army. This period between 1861, the Bascom Affair, to the eventual end of hostilities in 1872 has become popularly known as Cochise's War. In 1872, President Grant inaugurated the peace policy, and he selected General Howard, who was appointed as Special Indian Commissioner, to visit and negotiate with the tribes of Arizona and New Mexico, to negotiate peace and bring them onto reservations as wards of the government. Cochise is remembered for his sound judgment and diplomacy because of his willingness to negotiate and find peace with the Americans in spite of having lost several close relatives to the Army treachery in 1861. Lieutenant Joseph Alton Sladen, Thomas Jonathan Jeffords, Brigadier General Oliver Otis Howard, and Cochise met in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains of southern Arizona in October 1872 to negotiate the surrender and relocation of this most troublesome Apache group. General Howard and Captain Sladen went to Fort Tularosa in an effort to find someone who could communicate with Cochise. Howard had been told, while among the White Mountain Apaches, that if he went to Tularosa, he would find a guide among the Coyoterra band that lived there because Cochise had married in. There was a white man there as well who visited Cochise frequently and could, if he chose to, find Cochise and carry a message. This was Jeffords, of course. Chia, nephew of Cochise, was taken along, as was Ponce, who was a nephew-in-law to Cochise. Fort Tularosa in Catron County, New Mexico, was a military installation formerly located on the site of present-day Oregon on New Mexico Highway 12. This fort was established in 1872 and named after Tularosa Creek, on whose east banks it was located. Fort Tularosa was built to protect the agency of the newly created Apache Reservation, which was intended for about 1,600 Apaches, then living at the Warm Springs Apache Reservation. But the Apache didn't want to move, so about half of them fled to the hills. Howard's trip began at Fort Tularosa in New Mexico and moved through southwestern New Mexico into southern Arizona, where our story begins. John Rockefeller provided a map years later showing the route. This particular map shows several camps and the route taken there and back. This area is near where Howard, Jeffords, Sladen, and the others camped after traversing the Dragoon Mountains and coming to the west side of the Dragoons. While the rest of the party rested, one of the Apaches went into the mountains to the north. He returned later that afternoon with 2 boys on a horse. They had sent word of the intended meeting with Cochise. They went northward from this location and then westward about 6 or 7 miles to a camp labeled Camp B on this map, which is up a canyon in the mountains. And it would be difficult to tell precisely where they went without this map. Following along the western flank of the Dragoon Mountains between Camp A and Camp B, Sladen commented, "Winding about among the foothills, we at last struck the bed of a crooked stream and followed it back up a moderate ascent through a narrow pass, rock-bound on either hand. We entered a gradually broadening valley in the very heart of the mountains." This is the general location of Camp B, looking west down the canyon. Despite modern and historic disturbance, a wickiup ring or 2 are visible in this area. General Howard described this area and the camp where they stayed, stating, "The bright scene of the campfire ended when our party broke up. The women and old men went away to the sloping debris for the night camps." The group stayed the night at Camp B because Cochise was not there, and their intent was to meet with him. And finally, the next morning, Cochise arrived. We heard some of the peculiar Indian shouting in the distance, and Ponce said in Spanish, "He is coming." At the sound of the shouting, some preparations were made near us for his reception by making a circle among the Indians and spreading a blanket upon the ground for a seat. From that location, they went on to what is now known as the treaty site, or Camp C. The approximate location of Cochise's campsite at the time of General Howard's visit has long been known to be somewhere along the western foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. It's been common knowledge for about 130 years that the campsite held by Cochise's band during the peace talks was on the west side of the Dragoon Mountains, somewhere near the entrance to what is now called the West Stronghold. It was known to be in the general vicinity of West Stronghold Canyon, but there was no definite on-the-ground evidence of the actual location. One reason for this ambiguity is that the historical accounts pertaining to the trip and the camp itself are vague, allowing for multiple interpretations. Council Rocks has long been the officially designated location of the historic treaty. A Forest Service plaque marks the spot. Yet that is not the location of this historic event. The location of this site was lost to modern historians until it was rediscovered in the 1990s by archaeologist William Gillespie. And the attributes of this location can now be compared to the narrative accounts left by those involved in the treaty negotiations. Sladen, who spent 2 weeks there, provides quite accurate descriptions of the area where specific activities took place. As he noted, the encampment was in a recess made by projecting spurs, the mountain walls around it being broken and seamed and rugged, and the ground about scattered with broken and detached boulders and rocks. They saw a white flag over a sharp cone-shaped hill, later called Treaty Peak. This view shows the proximity of Knob Hill, otherwise known as Treaty Peak, since it's here that Cochise directed Jeffords and Sladen to post a white flag to declare the making of peace. We're fortunate to have photos that tell us precisely where certain events during the peace negotiations occurred. Robert Forbes took this photo in 1913, and the image purports to show the site of the peace treaty. This claim was based on information he received from Billy Four, a local rancher. It's assumed that it was Jeffords who pointed out the location to Four. This photo is featured in Ed Sweeney's book, Making Peace with Cochise. This is inferred to be at least one of the spots where Cochise held meetings with his key lieutenants, while Jeffords, Howard, and Sladen anxiously awaited the results back in camp. The formal meeting took place beneath the shade of a broad spreading tree near at hand. That is, as many sat within the shade as could get within its agreeable cover, and the others gathered in circle after circle on the outside. Showing the photos she took, Alice Rollins Crane asked Jeffords and Howard about each location. Crane's photograph shows what is probably a portion of the shelter inhabited by Cochise and probably the Cathedral Rock, or Big Rock. Jeffords told Crane that Cochise and General Howard had stood on the Big Rock to announce to the band that peace had been decided on. This rock is situated adjacent to the flat boulder that was a favored sitting area for Cochise. Sladen specified that from this rock one could see in every direction, a detail that implies considerable height or elevation or both. From the flat top of a large boulder I sat smoking and watched them for miles as they skirted the mountain. It was atop this rock, or the cathedral rock adjacent to it, that Cochise stood side by side with General Howard to announce to his Apaches that peace had been decided on. We know the photo of the rock is the same photo because on the reverse, in Crane's handwriting, appears the following notation. The big rock a few feet south of the cathedral, where Captain said you and Cochise had many a talk over peacemaking. Captain calls it the rock on which peace was made, as he says it was here that Cochise first began to really and seriously consider the matter with you. Furthermore, in her letter of introduction to General Howard in 1895, she offered to send the general copies of several photos and excitedly proclaimed, "I have a splendid one of what Captain Jeffords told me was the rock where you and Cochise stood when peace was declared." Alice did send a batch of photos to Howard. Howard confirms the authenticity of the professed locations captured in the prints. It was behind this rock, according to Sladen, that Cochise had built his home. Riding up to a large flat boulder, we dismounted, and the old chief, pointing to the shade of a tree behind the stone, said, "My home." I was bidden into the recess behind a huge boulder where the old chief made his home. Soon after we got back to camp from our visit to the top of the mountain, Cochise's wife called me to their domicile behind the big rock, said Sladen. There's only one rock shelter in this immediate vicinity that requires that one go behind the recess of a huge boulder. Others are present, but they're further away. This place was described in detail by General Howard in an article he wrote mere weeks following the conclusion of his historic journey. He said it consisted of sandstone, actually granite, rock, 20 feet high, having one perpendicular side, and near it a large-sized scrub oak. One or two boughs had been cut and laid up against the tree to thicken the shade, being the only artificial work about this house. A place for sleeping, a little longer than a man, was hollowed out in the ground. In addition, there are a number of other smaller rock shelters in this general location. Rock shelters were the preferred shelter type of Cochise's people. This one shown here is especially long, but not high, and without soil, and it's cleaned out in a way others are not. This makes me wonder if it's not where they kept the wounded warrior that Sladen discussed. One of their warriors had been desperately wounded in some encounter with the whites and was kept hidden away among the rocks at our camp. Sladen makes several references in his journal, which was written while in camp with Cochise, to the large flat boulder that Cochise favored to the point that he would sit on it for hours with Jeffords, smoking and talking things over in Spanish. A large flat boulder some 4 or 5 feet in height and as broad across the top occupied a prominent position in the camp and screened a corner where Cochise made his domicile. It was to the old chief a sort of throne, and he looked the very monarch as he sat there with his long sheet gathered about him like a robe of state. We all seated ourselves upon the large flat boulder where Cochise spent most of his time. When they rode up, they went at once to the stone where Cochise was seated, dismounted, and sat down on the ground. With great deliberation, and without any demonstration of emotion of any kind, they reported to the chief. He rose to his feet, leaped to the ground, and as the returned warrior rose to his feet, the chief dealt him a violent blow upon his head that knocked him to the ground. It's possible to ride up to the flat rock in this area, to sit in front of it and hold a conversation, and to leap from it to the ground. There are a number of other feature types present that we recognize as archaeologists and that are typical of Apache camps and camps of other mobile peoples. For example, here there's walls that served as windbreaks, cairns, and rock art, and in this case, pictographs of various colors. Sladen stated, "They had no tents, no teepees, and only in a few instances had they troubled themselves to construct the usual wickiup, a rude shelter of brush covered with leaves and grass. They live in huts or shelters that were so ad hoc that the Spanish said they do not have houses, only huts. Finding only huts in the archaeological record can be a challenge, because pushing a few rocks aside to construct a brush shelter is far more difficult to notice archaeologically than are coursed walls or purposeful teepee rings. Hut shapes are quite variable, and their wickiups and conical teepees and so on left a range of footprints. We can see some of the variation in these photographs from the 1880s that show Apache structures when in use. And this is what these same structures look like today. As you can see, they're difficult to identify, but they're distinguished by rock outlines, cobbles or boulders, or clearings within a rocky field. A low density of stone artifacts are present on the Cochise-Howard Treaty site that represent the Apache occupation of this area. There are also glass and metal artifacts that relate to this specific period of history. As you can see here, the glass is worked. The result of this council was that the Indians should have a reservation at the eastern boundary of Arizona, with an agency to be established within a few miles of Fort Bowie to be known as the Chiricahua Reservation. That all of Cochise's Indians should be gathered there, that the boundary should be large enough to allow the Indians plenty of room for hunting, that Jeffers should be their agent. As a return for this, Cochise was to keep his Indians upon the reservation, should prevent all attacks upon the whites, either by his own Indians or any others, upon the state road and in the vicinity of his people. This is the stone outline to one of the structures at the agency and an aqua glass tool used by the Apache. Evidence of cultural activity occurs throughout the area because this area had a spring and so was used for a long period of time. As you can see here, there's a variety of mortar cups along this stone outcrop. The final council was held at Dragoon Springs in the pass through the mountains. Officers from Fort Bowie came. This council was held in the vicinity of the Dragoon Springs stage station. Contrary to common belief, no treaty was actually signed. Cochise requested that his people be allowed to remain in the Chiricahua Mountains and that Jeffers be made Indian agent for the region. These requests were granted, and Apache raids subsided. However, certain white residents of the area disapproved of this arrangement because it denied them access to the copper and silver that had been discovered on Apache lands. They branded Jeffords Indian lover and wrote scathing reports to politicians back in Washington. In 1875, Jeffords was removed as federal agent, and the Chiricahua Apache were relocated to the San Carlos Reservation. Cochise was spared this indignity. He died less than a year after agreeing to the now broken treaty. The Apache Wars began again, but were ended in 1886 with the surrender of Geronimo, the last free Apache leader in the United States.